But the pleasurable life, the Epicureans would say, is one that consists in really mastering desire, not satisfying desire.
Mm-hmm.
And that is probably as core of an Epicurean tenet as there is.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
Today, we're going to be talking about Epicureanism. The Epicureans were a rival school to the Stoics. They were an ancient life philosophy, ancient school that were competitors to the Stoics. So we've had past episodes about them. That's sort of an introductory episode, episode 10, about the philosophy and share some of our thoughts, objections to it. And then we also have some interview episodes. Michael has a conversation with Catherine Wilson. That's episode 70. And then I have a conversation with Emily Austin. That's episode 34. But today what we're going to do is focus on what is of value from this school. And as an example of that, we're going to be talking about Seneca, because if you've ever read Seneca's moral letters, one of the first things you'll notice is that he quotes Epicurus a lot, despite the fact that Epicurus is a rival philosopher, despite the fact that the Stoics have so many disagreements with the Epicureans. So he's sort of a existence proof of the fact that one can learn a lot from rival philosophies. And we'll be going through some of the places where he quotes Epicurus by name. He also talks a little bit about Methodorus, another Epicurean, and see where that lines up with Stoicism and see what we can take away from those quotes.
Yeah, it sounds great. So if before we were looking at Epicureanism just on its own, just like what is it, how does it work? Now it's, well, if you're a Stoic or anybody else looking to live better, I guess what can you take from it? And I've always loved Seneca's approach to this. I've always loved Seneca's engagement with other philosophies. So looking forward to it. Let's do it.
Yeah, so we'll start by saying a little bit about what Epicureanism is. If you want a deeper dive, of course, go to some of those other episodes I mentioned in the beginning. And then talk about this question, why does Seneca quote Epicurus so often to begin with? What's his approach there? Because he does give us details. He does answer that question in his letters, and then go through some of the key lessons that Seneca has pulled out, some of these key quotes from Epicurus, and see, what can we learn from those, both, as you say, as Stoics, people who are attracted to Stoicism in some way or another, or just generally when you're thinking about your philosophy of life, what it is to live well. There's a lot of overlap between the different schools, even when they're rivals, of course. So we'll be looking at some of those key lessons that I think can be applied broadly, especially at least when we're thinking about some of these ancient Greco-Roman philosophies of life. Cool. So want to hop into what it is?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So what is Epicureanism? Quick refresher. First, it's a hedonistic philosophy. It says that the best life is the pleasurable one. And of course, it's important to remember here that the hedonistic life for the Epicureans was achieved by living virtuously. And when they're thinking about pleasure, they focused not entirely, but spent most of their attention on reducing pain, avoiding pain, while taking advantage of sort of the essential pleasures, friendship, minimal meals, and so on. So what you get from the Epicureans is it begins with a sort of hedonistic foundation, but then begins to look somewhat similar to some of these other virtue ethics, where they say, actually, in order to live well, one must master your desires for these fleeting pleasures that don't bring long lasting satisfaction, and instead set your sight on a life of tranquility, a life where you avoid illusions, a life where you avoid pain. And that's achieved by mastering desires and experiencing some of these basic pleasures of life. So they're by no means the what you might think of as a hedonist today, if you were to use that term in a critical way, in a negative way. Instead, they're rather measured and moderate philosophers.
Yeah, and you can think about this because the hedonistic label, that's just what you're measuring, or that's just what you're trying to maximize. And then that doesn't necessarily come, if you had never heard that term before, that doesn't necessarily come with a picture of the good life. It just says that's what we're trying to maximize. What that looks like in practice is still undiscovered. And then the Epicureans provide a particular answer to that, as you said, which is one that's more moderate. And if that sounds a bit unintuitive, or it sounds like, well, they don't actually think pleasure is the good, if they argue for like minimal food, you can think of something like an addict is a really good example of the hedonistic pictures. Like, do you think of somebody who's a drug addict, somebody who's addicted to gambling, addicted to any sort of short-term spike in pleasure? Do you think that person has a pleasurable life? Do we look at those people and go, wow, that is the life that has the most pleasure? No, we don't, because it's one that has these short-term spikes and then these long valleys, probably the greatest gap, probably the greatest dissonance between high and bottom, but not the highest sustained heights. And so I think that's like a quick example of the Epicurean argument and why they really are still hedonists, even though they argue for a kind of moderation.
Right. Yeah, that's a good example, because I think they're sort of asking the question, what life feels the best to lead? And you can think about the life of an addict as having an immense amount of pleasure, but it also has an immense amount of suffering. So, whereas someone who's able to achieve a stable state of tranquility might not be experiencing pleasure in the sense of euphoria on a moment to moment basis, but they have, a positive hum to their life or something of this sort, and they don't face those valleys that others may. And they're like the Stoics, able to endure what others might see as setbacks because they don't put as much of value into what so many people crave.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. So Seneca has one of his most well-known lines about Epicurus, as he's introducing one of his quotes from the man, is, "The thought for today is one which I discovered in Epicurus, for I am wont to cross over even into the enemy's camp, not as a deserter, but as a scout." And that's the key slogan, not as a deserter, but as a scout, that captures his approach. He is looking for truth and understands that, there's information in the ways that others think. It can be reminders, it could be novel information perhaps, but his approach is one of the seeker, not of the dogmatist who is aiming to win an argument. Instead, he's trying to get a lay of the land, a lay of reality in its to the extent that he can. So I think that's a excellent slogan. He also has another quote explaining why he goes to Epicurus so often. "There is no reason why you should hold that these words belong to Epicurus alone. They are public property. I think we ought to do in philosophy as they are wont to do in the Senate. When someone has made a motion of which I approve to a certain extent, I ask him to make his motion in 2 parts, and I vote for the part which I approve. So I am the more glad to repeat and distinguish words of Epicurus, in order that I may prove to those who have recourse to him through a bad motive, thinking that they will have in him a screen for their own vices, that they must live honorably, no matter what school they follow." So that's essentially expressing the same idea in the beginning. These words are a matter of public property. But he also introduces this other idea of decoupling ideas. You can recognize that an opponent has true beliefs, even if that's coupled with some false beliefs, perhaps. And so many times we get in debates with people who we might disagree with and see ourselves as aiming to fully defeat whatever they say. And of course, that bias might lead us to argue against claims which, if they had come up in any other context, we would see are true. Because we have this sort of oppositional stance, we immediately see them as false.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And it makes me also think of like separating the art from the artist too. Or, I mean, Seneca doesn't think Epicurus is a bad person. He doesn't think he's like a tyrant or a terrible individual. He just disagrees with him philosophically. But it's kind of a good lesson for, I think, a philosopher who's maybe done something that's morally dubious or has lived a life that you wouldn't admire wholesale. That doesn't, I mean, the words can be public property, right? And there's a kind of value you can take from those ideas. It's obviously a different question because, again, Epicurus is not a bad person, but I love that idea of, once it's been put out there, it's kind of a common good to make use of.
Right. And I suppose it goes to one distinction we've talked about here before from Julia Galef, and you have a conversation with her, as this distinction between the soldier mindset, scout mindset. And what Seneca is explicitly saying is he has a scout mindset towards the Epicureans, or at least is aspiring to it, where he's trying to see what's true here, not seeing himself as marshaling arguments to defeat the Epicureans. Or as another metaphor might be to an activist. An activist is aiming to use rhetoric in a way that achieves their goal, where the scout is just trying to get an accurate lay of the land, that map.
Yeah, I love it. That's I would say, an intellectual quality that I think is one of the highest that you could have. It couples with humility, but that scout mindset is, I think, a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yep. One other thought Seneca has, I'm curious to get your response to this one as well, is that he suggests in some places that Stoicism and Epicureanism really are quite similar. And even to the extent that perhaps the Epicureans and some Stoics who argued against them were making futile distinctions, or perhaps engaged in almost verbal arguments of some sort or another. At least that's how I read this line about Epicurus. So he says, Epicurus also decided that one who possesses virtue is happy, but that virtue of itself is not sufficient for the happy life, because the pleasure that results from virtue, and not virtue itself, makes one happy. This is a futile distinction. For the same philosopher declares that virtue never exists without pleasure, and therefore, if virtue is always connected with pleasure and always inseparable therefrom, virtue is of itself sufficient. What's your response to that?
Yeah, so I mean, Seneca's arguing that if Epicurus thinks that virtue and pleasure are necessarily related or necessarily interentailing, or if virtue necessarily causes pleasure, then virtue is sufficient for happiness, because if you have virtue, you'll have pleasure, and therefore you'll have happiness. I think there's like two levels you can take this on. On one level, there's this idea of like, why are we fighting so much? Like, if we're both aiming for the same target, and the Stoic says, well, you're aiming for the target, and the Epicurean says, no, you're aiming for the thing that's exactly behind the bullseye of the target. You both kind of aim the same way. You both practice. You both pull the bow. You both develop the same skill as the archer. And it's like, well, we really shouldn't argue this much. It's more just like a kind of a verbal nuance. That would be the charitable way to take what Seneca's saying. I think if I wanted to put on my philosopher hat and be really nitpicky about it, I guess I'd have to see Epicurus's arguments, but maybe there could be cases where you could have virtue and virtue brings pleasure, but not enough pleasure to make you happy. So it's necessary because an unvirtuous person will be guilty and anxious and jealous and greedy and desiring. So it's necessary, but maybe it's not sufficient because there's a certain pleasure that comes with virtue. But, again, the classic Stoic argument that you could be happy on the torture rack.
Mm-hmm.
It seems very plausible to me that the Epicurean could say, well, virtue is necessary for happiness, but it's not sufficient because you get a pleasure of a good character, but it doesn't overcome, the physical pain of being tortured, for example. But that's I would say the second part where I would say, I don't think you should fully collapse them philosophically, although in practice they might end up looking nearly indistinguishable.
Right. Yeah, there is a distinction there. This line reminded me of Nassim Taleb, who we recently cited about his book Anti-Fragile, who I think his way of thought is more pragmatic, practical, and would I think challenge some maybe traditional Stoics, traditional Epicureans who thought, if there's a serious distinction between their schools, where does it come out in action? Yes, there is a philosophical difference. It's grounding. The good life is a happiness, is a virtue, and we can think of edge cases. But where's that decision, that career path, that question about political maybe engagement, where the philosophy makes a difference? Otherwise, basically just talking about the same thing.
Well, I think that there's also, that's a great point. I think maybe there might be, so I think maybe pragmatically collapse them and say like, yeah, both need virtue. But I think what virtue ends up looking like, you can both agree with that and then have a different argument for virtue. And I do think that's where it comes out in practice. I think in practice, we'll probably get into this later, this episode, but in practice, the biggest distinction is kind of your obligations towards other people, your obligations for kind of social and political involvement. Whereas I think Epicureanism can be quite selfish, where Stoicism essentially is not. And that's, I think, a difference of what actually virtue looks like in practice.
Right. Yeah, that'd be a way of answering the challenge.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Well, let's get into some of these places where Seneca quotes Epicurus. So I took a number of lines from Epicurus from Seneca's Moral Letters, the letters to Lucilius, and grouped them under different headings. So we can go through these headings. The first place where he thinks that Epicurus illustrates a truth, something that's true, is that philosophy is exceptionally important. It's a part of living well. In particular, the pursuit of knowledge. So Epicurus has one aphorism: the knowledge of vice is the beginning of salvation, which is something the Stoics, in addition to other Greek and Roman philosophers, would agree with 100%. They're interested in pursuing knowledge, and often self-improvement involves, as a first step, that knowledge of vice, those places where one misses the mark.
Yeah, it makes me think of Socrates. I know that I know nothing as the beginning of philosophy. I also think about that passage in Plato's Symposium when they talk about the philosopher loves wisdom, and love entails kind of a lack, a longing, a desire to have something you don't have. And so this picture of like, how could you love self-improvement? How could you love knowledge or pursue knowledge unless you recognize there's a lack there, to recognize that you don't have it, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't have that kind of motivation to change without a recognition that you're not at the destination you want to be at.
Mm-hmm. Another line from Epicurus Seneca uses is, if you would enjoy real freedom, you must be the slave of philosophy. And Seneca continues in his own words, The man who submits and surrenders himself to her is not kept waiting. He is emancipated on the spot. For the very service of philosophy is freedom. And that one's sort of, I think, a classic, in a way, paradox. In order to be truly free, you need to submit yourself to something. At least follows that form. But the general idea, of course, is to put this practice of philosophy at that central point in one's life. The practice of philosophy is going to be what leads to the excellent life, according to both the Stoics and the Epicureans. And that's Epicurus' way is a memorable way to put it.
Yeah, this is just basically responding to what these remind me of, but it's interesting how it's differs from Epictetus. Seneca saying like you're not kept waiting. Even just studying philosophy is freedom. Where I think Epictetus would be a little bit more harsh on that and say it's the path to freedom. You might be kept waiting, but Seneca seems to be a bit more positive here. But yeah, both think philosophy as a way of life is the way to go. And if you don't do this, you're in trouble.
Yeah, Seneca's somewhat unclear, at least in a section that I read, how fast, how long do you need to be in service before you're free?
Hey, well, I've got one weekend, but I'm not gonna, I don't want to commit too much time to this.
Yeah, that's right. I think on one hand, he has this view that the sage is rare, a very rare occurrence. So perhaps here we're seeing more of a rhetorical flourish, right? So you're not free in an instant, but you're on the path, which is probably similar to Epictetus's view.
Yeah. Seneca likes the flourish.
Yeah. Another category I have here is urgency. Epicurus has this wonderful quote: "The fool, with all his other faults, has this also. He is always getting ready to live." And then he has another, Seneca also puts this as, "It is bothersome always to be beginning life." Those two make me think of Epictetus's lines about the Olympics. The Olympic Games have started. What are you doing? Costing his students against, putting off their efforts to live well in the moment, whether that's by engaging in too much study, thinking you need to answer more questions before you're ready, or putting your hopes in some other teacher. I think in the Epicureans, a philosophy that pursues tranquility, we still see that focus that, you don't have so much time perhaps, and it's best to get going while you can.
Yeah. So what's the argument? Like when he says the fool is always getting ready to live, the point here is that you're not really living unless you're doing philosophy. You're kind of always at the start of the Olympics, but not actually competing. Is that the idea?
Yeah, let me look at this letter. This is from the letter on groundless fears, but I think this is one of the letters where he takes a little bit of a detour. Sometimes Seneca will start a letter on a theme, and then we'll end up with, in closing, I have this excellent line from some other philosopher that is not obviously connected to the theme. But he says, "Reflect, my esteemed Lucilius, what this saying means, and you'll see how revolting is the fickleness of men who lay down every day new foundations of life and begin to build up fresh hopes, even at the brink of the grave." And I think here it's you can read the fool with all his faults has this also. He's always getting ready to live as the claim that the fool procrastinates.
Yep,
They're always getting ready
that
to
makes sense.
pursue that career. But there's also that thought that they're not fully devoted to what they're doing. Especially in other letters, you see Seneca critique people who read widely but not deeply, or bounce from plan to plan, almost in a way bounce from identity to identity. If you want to think about this in the role ethics case, they haven't found the roles to devote themselves to fully, and in that sense, they are not fully living. I think that's the way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the person who's like, I'll write my novel eventually, or, I'll retire and then I'll start doing the things I want to do. There's something tied in there with like memento mori,
Mhm.
like not realizing that you'll die, not realizing that, you need to live for the now. And so just kind of off putting that and being stuck in this, I guess, this complacency. Um, yeah, it's not good. I'm sympathetic towards it, but not good.
Right, right. Yep. So there again, we have a useful reminder from the Epicureans. I think so. Then one theme that I wanted to talk about that Seneca probably quotes Epicurus on the most is on the use of material wealth and our desires for material wealth. So a number of letters, he'll quote Epicurus on this theme. Some examples are: he who needs riches least enjoys riches most. Poverty brought into conformity with law of nature is great wealth. And also, the acquisition of riches has been for many men not an end, but a change of troubles. And he continues. We can go through a few more of those as these come up. But you can see, I think Seneca himself was a very wealthy man because of his political positions. He owned a substantial amount of property. And that forces him to have an answer. How do you use wealth well? What is the Stoic answer to that? What is the virtuous use of wealth? And I think to some extent he finds it in Epicurus. And Epicurus was someone who was not rich, did not have a high position in society, but rather lived in essentially a secluded community and taught, these themes that are really quite, in a sense, Stoic. Also, you get some sense of Musonius Rufus's teachings here from those lines, I think. And just about those reminders, I suppose, about what one's desires are and how that shapes how you relate to wealth. That so much of our cravings for wealth bring not an end to our sufferings, but a change.
Yeah, that makes me think of, that makes me think of people that win the lottery, right? That I think not just anecdotal, but I think actually measurable, where people kind of reset to a baseline happiness. And you think, well, if I win the lottery, things are going to be perfect. But no, it's just, you quickly kind of fall back to that baseline static happiness. Now it's just different. Now it's just like, oh, I can't go outside without people bugging me. Oh, people in my family are asking things, or, oh, I'm trying to kind of hit that. I'm trying to hit that rush. I also think there's kind of like a depression that occurs for people after they win the Olympics, the modern Olympics, or you achieve a goal you've achieved, and it's not, you don't, I mean, we're talking about material wealth, but that kind of recognition of the heat, like it takes a hedonist to really understand the hedonistic treadmill, right? It takes a hedonist to really understand, oh, wow, now that I've actually thought a lot about the nature of pleasure, it's clear to me that my way to get pleasure is not actually to have the thing that I desire, or the thing that I would say most people desire, material wealth, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's pretty insightful. You pointed that out with Seneca too. There's that irony of him being one of the richest men in the world at the time. I don't know, probably, I don't know perfectly, but certainly top 1,000 in my, as far as I can tell. So you're talking about like today's equivalent of like a billionaire or something like this, right? Or like a very, very, very rich person, um, reflecting on the nature of wealth and kind of, uh, I guess, agreeing with it from a position of experience and agreeing with the wisdom in these claims. Because sometimes these claims can be seen as the rationalization of people that don't have wealth, right? And Stoicism, I think, gets that criticism too. It's like the rationalization of the people that don't have the things they want. So to see the rich person agreeing with this, now, I mean, not necessarily giving up his wealth and leaving it all away, but agreeing with this is, I think, kind of interesting.
Right, right. And I think you can see, especially with that line, the acquisition of riches has been for many men not an end, but a change of troubles. You see that in Seneca's life. He becomes
Yeah, totally.
exceptionally wealthy, likely didn't experience the euphoria that he predicted, or at least others would have predicted for him. And in the end, is forced to give up his wealth, or at least offers to give up his wealth, return it to Nero, who he serves as a political advisor, in order to escape politics, in order to leave politics, which is the very thing, of course, that brought his wealth to him. So there you see exceptional success, but with that success came the sword of Damocles, I suppose. It's one way to put it. Much higher risk for Seneca, and a risk that's realized at the end of his life as Nero orders him to commit suicide.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. No, let's keep going and keep hearing what Epicurus has to say.
All right, cool. So I think some other themes we have from both on material wealth is we have another line about Pythocles, which summarizes this Epicurean view of desire. If you wish to make Pythocles rich, do not add to his store of money, but subtract from his desires. And I think to abstract this out from material wealth, you can think about it as a principle for using indifference well, indifference like wealth, but also achievement, social status. For the Stoics, another pleasure itself would be an indifference. And what Seneca thinks we can take away from this is that theme of mastering desires for those things that don't bring lasting satisfaction, lasting happiness, which is, of course, a difficult project, but that is the project of philosophy, is mastering our desires by changing how we think, and in particular, how we think about the nature of happiness, and internalizing that, those, or I suppose building up a character by repeatedly making decisions that show how our desires have changed and moved from thought into action.
Yeah, agree with that. As you were saying, that focus on, well, philosophy has this focus on the internal, and then also this link here between Epicureanism and Stoics. I mean, the Stoics just call it the discipline of desire. I don't think the Epicureans divided their philosophy in that way, where they had a discipline of desire, but both just recognizing the, I guess, harmful nature of desire. There's also kind of play on rich here, like a kind of obviously a word play. There was that other quote before about poverty brought into conformity with the law of nature is great wealth. There's this kind of play on what it means to be wealthy, what it means to have things that resonates. I think it's really hard though. This is really hard because, and that's the thing when you see, I think that's also the thing that's so perverse about like productivity hack stoicism. at the end of the day, these philosophies are about controlling your desires, reducing your desires, not in like a not in a way that's like life denying, but in a way that's that you're basically refocusing them on what matters and
Hmm.
what is really important. And so when you productivity hack stoicism, you're just you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. You're not questioning your desires, you're not changing your desires, and you can just be you're doing this unreflectively. Obviously there's space for productivity in any sort of life, but at its worst, you're non-reflectively just using it to satisfy your desires, which is like totally things mixed up.
Right, right. I think that's something one can learn from the Stoics, but perhaps maybe learn best from some of the Eastern
Yeah.
traditions is this other idea that desire always is always reemerging. And it's something one is always uh, working on either reducing or accepting in particular ways, right? You start with an insight, like the idea that wealth is not of absolute value, and then catch yourself overvaluing status and the status that comes from a some other, maybe the position that this view gives you or something of that sort, and then adjust your character in some other ways, and then find that desire reemerges again in some other form.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just a part of the stoic path, I suppose, or path. That's just part of the path of improvement.
Yeah, and as you said, the Eastern religions maybe do it best or focus on it the most, but it's really here in Stoicism, and it's there in Epicureanism as well, and it's interesting that it's there in Epicurean. Well, maybe not interesting once you actually know it, but it's like that's that. There's something so ironic about that, which is like the path to pleasure, not the path to satisfaction. Maybe the path, maybe I mean, I'm using English words here, so it's getting a little
Mhm.
twisted up. But the pleasurable life, the Epicureans would say, is one that consists in really mastering desire, not satisfying desire.
Mhm.
And that is probably as core of an Epicurean tenet as there is. I think that's probably one of the main, probably the main ethical insight of the Epicurean.
Yeah, I think so. And I think they reject that caricatured hedonist view because of that, because of the fact that so many exceptionally pleasurable, ecstatic, euphoric experiences, what have you, come with this awakening of desire or feed desire.
I'm going to sound really naive here because I don't really know much about hard drugs, and I am naive. So, but I sometimes think in a vacuum. Okay, I'll view everything this way, but I'm like, you know, if I could do heroin and not be addicted to it, and like ethically source it and just have this incredibly pleasurable experience, I'm like that seems appealing. But the thing that prevents me from doing that is a recognition that it's then associated like chemically and physically with like an extreme desire that follows afterwards, and a extreme desire that's like uh, difficult to satisfy and perpetually there. And so I like I'm it's a silly example, but it's an example for me that kind of highlights this nature in its purest form, which is that, look, if I could get that peak without the valley, yeah, there's no issue with that. But the issue is that it's naturally tied in with that valley, and the peaks, as far as I'm aware, get harder and harder to achieve. And so that's it in a very that's what we're talking about in a very uh, extreme sense. But it's the same kind of thing when if you're making more and more money, lifestyle creep, anything like this, or more and more status. There's always somebody you want to impress. There's always somebody you want to like you or think a certain thing about you. And look, if you could have any of those ecstatic experiences without the crash, I don't see any problem with it. You're not hurting anybody, but you're hurting yourself because they come with that crash, right?
Hmm. No, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And effectively, what you see with even other less extreme pleasures,
Yeah.
um, you see it's the same patterns. Um, well, so I think those are some thoughts on how the Epicureans saw material wealth and where Seneca quoted them. Uh, Last theme here we can talk about, or last large theme I wanted to chat about was on friendship. So the Epicureans disagreed with the Stoics, where they thought that the happy life must include some amount of friendship, which, of course, the given our social nature and the circumstances we happen to be in, the Stoics hold, agree with that claim to some extent. But Seneca does have a letter where he says, in a real sense, the sage doesn't need friends, but if they find themselves in society, then they will have friends, which I think that the Epicureans will disagree with. But nonetheless, given that we find ourselves in society, there are lessons we can take from the Epicureans. And that's what Seneca does. One place where he quotes Epicurus on this very theme is that Epicurus once said, "The wise man is self-sufficient." And then he continues, "This phrase, my dear Lucilius, is incorrectly explained by many, for they withdraw the wise man from the world and force him to dwell within his own skin. But we must mark with care what this sentence signifies and how far it applies. The wise man is sufficient unto himself for a happy existence, but not for mere existence, for he needs many helps towards mere existence. But for a happy existence, he needs only a sound and upright soul, one that despises fortune." So here, even in the explanation of the sentence, you can see that a little bit of disagreement with Epicureanism, but nonetheless, he does make that distinction that I think Epicurus would as well, which is the idea that the wise man is self-sufficient does not entail a rejection of society, and also, of course, does not entail that they're the best competitor and survivor or something of this sort. They can literally live on their own, which is not true for the majority of humans, perhaps. Yeah, what do you think about that?
I mean, I like my friends. I think friends are nice. I think this is, I'm on the pro friend bandwagon here. There's something to be said. I mean, it's interesting to me with Epicureanism where I can't tell if it's like a priori or a posteriori, which is, I can't tell if the Epicureans are making their arguments empirically, which is to say, look, we've seen 100 people and we've seen the person that's the happiest. And it's that guy who eats simply and hangs out with his buddies. Or if it's or if they have some sort of principle that they're deriving these arguments from. Because it seems like modern science agrees empirically, right? There's that, I was just reading about this long-term Harvard study. I think it started in 1935 and it's ongoing. It's brought in people's children to keep it going. And it said empirically, I think it was physical health was really important. And then your loneliness and your connections with other people were some of the most important indicators for self-reported long-term happiness. So I think there's this, there's just this empirical fact when you look at it at the level of pleasure,
Mm-hmm.
that, yeah, relationships matter. And this kind of, I think, relates to that virtue quality, which is that you're probably going to have better relationships if you're kind, forgiving, just. If you have these kind of virtues, you're probably going to have better relationships with people, more honest friendships, less transactional relationships, and things like this. So it all makes sense to me, an Epicurean picture there. Hey, it's observational, and maybe even if they're a bit off, you only need one good friend instead of a room of friends.
Sure.
But the argument's there. The Stoic idea of friendship, this is something we've talked about before. It's not really clear to me why a friend would be a good and not just a preferred indifferent. Maybe you have a sense of that. I think it's a good. I think it's like a preferred indifferent. It's something we should select. But it's interesting for me to hear Seneca talk about the wise man, you know, needing friends in this capacity, or maybe I've misunderstood.
Yeah, it's not so much that they. I think Seneca has a traditional Stoic view where they do not need friends in order to live a happy life, but they do need other people, of course, for mere existence. Which is just to say, that one needs to live in a society to survive. We're social animals. Um, so, um, I suppose this is a quote. This is a place where the Epicureans and Stoics disagree. In the real sense, the Stoics think the wise man is self-sufficient and at least does not need society for their happiness, even if they need them for mere existence.
Yeah, I do think as progressing Stoics, like I think a lot of it gets muddled when we start talking about the wise man. I think as progressing Stoics, we probably have something like the Epicurean would say, doesn't matter who you are, eat well, sleep well, have enough food and have enough shelter that you can live comfortably, but not so much that you get like uh vain and shallow and desire more. And then like have a good group of friends you trust and could like talk to and make good relationships with. That just sounds like good common sense advice. And I think the progressing Stoic, we can really put a lot of responsibility for our development on ourselves. You can become a very lonely microcosm of a world when you become the inner citadel guarding impressions out there, fighting
Right.
off, fighting off false impressions of the world. And I think there's something to be said for somebody progressing, just like connecting with other people, whether that's about philosophy or that's even just about things that are more casual. But I have a huge benefit in kind of processing how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, my friends, the people that are close to me. And, whether the sage needs that or not, what that looks like for the sage or not, it's certainly something that I think Epicurus emphasizes the right amount, and Stoicism probably emphasizes a bit too little. At least, at least Epictetus does for the progressing Stoic.
Hmm. Yeah, that's it. I think the Stoics do a good job emphasizing roles one plays in society, but perhaps do uh, underrate in some respect our dependence on others and what we can learn from others, especially as progressors. Dependence both in, of course, this mere existence sense that Seneca is talking about, but also if we think about others who are walking the path and in different places, there's much to learn there as well. There are a number of places where Seneca quotes Epicurus um, with full agreements. Both the Stoics and Epicureans agree about the view of death. They think it's the virtuous person does not fear death. They agree on the importance of role models, modeling yourself after someone of high character, and of course on the importance of philosophy and the virtuous life. But I think we can end it there. That's a general tour of some of the themes Seneca pulls out from Epicurus, and I think a good example of someone looking for places of agreement, places where one's so-called opponent has put things in an illuminating way. A good example of someone playing the role of a scout.
Yeah, specifically those last two we talked about. Desire, like using indifference well by managing desire, limiting desire, and focusing on friendship. Yeah, and another way to think about it is like who could have, if you want to learn how to swim, go and talk to a swimmer. If you want to learn how to manage indifference well, go talk to the person who thinks that the the secret to life is, pleasure and managing their indifference well. And they'll have something to tell you about, how you desire things or the benefits of friendship. Because friendship, I guess, here is one of those hacks. It's one of the things that you can want and want and want, and it kind of at least seems to have a positive return. It's one of those indifference that you can lean more into and get more out of. And so, yeah, you go to the expert, you go to the specialist. The Epicureans, if you want to learn about that, they're the people to go to. And I think that's a good emphasis that any Stoic or, any person in general can learn from.
Nice. Yeah, that's well put. Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Gub.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.